Have you ever met someone who genuinely enjoys being alone? Not lonely, not bitter, not depressed, just alone. The person who cancels plans and secretly feels relieved, who disappears for days without explanation, who can spend an entire weekend by themselves and feel completely fine afterward. Maybe they read. Maybe they walk for hours with headphones on. Maybe they sit in silence without needing to fill it. And while everyone else assumes something must be wrong with them, psychology suggests something much more interesting. Because many people who prefer solitude are not running away from people, they're running towards safety. And that pattern often begins much earlier than most people realize. As children, we're supposed to learn a very important lesson. Other people are emotionally safe. When a child feels scared, overwhelmed, excited, confused, or hurt, they naturally reach outward, toward a parent, a sibling, a trusted adult. And when those emotional needs are met consistently, something important happens inside the nervous system. The child learns, people help regulate me. Connection feels safe. I can depend on others when life feels difficult. But what happens when that lesson never fully forms? What happens when vulnerability gets ignored? When emotions are criticized? When asking for comfort leads to rejection, embarrassment, or disappointment? The child adapts, and the adaptation is actually incredibly intelligent. Instead of relying on people, they begin relying on themselves. Instead of expressing emotions openly, they process them privately. Instead of expecting support, they minimize their needs. Over time, self-sufficiency becomes emotional protection. And eventually, what began as survival starts looking like personality. Years later, people say things like, "You're so independent. You never need anyone. You're so low maintenance." But sometimes independence is just a wound that learned how to function beautifully. Because underneath that calm self-sufficiency is often a child who quietly learned, it's safer not to need too much from people. And here's the part most people misunderstand. Many solitude-loving people do not dislike others. In fact, many of them care very deeply. They enjoy meaningful conversations. They value close friendships. They love deeply when they trust someone. They are not avoiding connection itself. They're avoiding emotional unpredictability, because their nervous system learned long ago that solitude is consistent. People are not. Solitude doesn't suddenly withdraw affection. It doesn't criticize vulnerability. It doesn't disappoint you after you finally trust it. Alone feels manageable, predictable, safe. And once the brain starts associating solitude with safety, it can become incredibly difficult to give up. This is why some people feel exhausted after social interaction, even when they enjoyed it. It's not always introversion. Sometimes it's hypervigilance. Their nervous system is constantly monitoring, how am I being perceived? Am I saying too much? Am I becoming a burden? Will this connection eventually hurt me? And that level of subconscious processing is exhausting. So they retreat back into solitude, not because they hate people, but because it's the only environment where their nervous system fully unclenches. Now here's where this gets important. Preferring solitude is not automatically unhealthy. Some of the most creative, reflective, emotionally intelligent people in history spend enormous amounts of time alone. Solitude can deepen self-awareness. It can strengthen creativity. It can bring clarity that constant noise never could. The real question is, why does being alone feel safer than being known? Because there's a difference between solitude that nourishes you and solitude that protects you. One feels peaceful. The other feels necessary. And sometimes the hardest thing for deeply independent people is realizing they never actually learned how to rest inside another person emotionally. Not because they're broken, because at some point they learned emotional dependence came with risk. But here's the hopeful part. The nervous system can learn new experiences too. A person who learned to survive alone can still slowly learn that safe connection exists, that not every relationship requires self-protection, that vulnerability does not always lead to rejection, that closeness and safety are not opposites. But that usually happens very slowly, not through forcing extroversion, not through pretending to suddenly love crowds, not through shaming themselves for needing space. It happens through small experiences of emotional safety repeated over time, being understood without judgment, being allowed to have needs, being emotionally honest, and discovering the relationship survives it. That's what begins changing the pattern. So if you're someone who loves solitude, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Just ask yourself honestly, does solitude energize me or does it protect me? Because the answer to that question reveals more about your past than most people realize, and sometimes it quietly shapes your entire future.